I'm a little sad not to see all your beautiful faces in person. This is the first time, of course, and the learning process has been awesome. And thank you to Brian for being such a fantastic leader in a non-linear process. It's my joy and pleasure to introduce again George Sugai as our keynote speaker this morning. And I need you to know that from 2002 to 2013, George was always the keynote speaker. And the reason he was is because he's the most phenomenal teacher that we know. So if you're not familiar with George, you're in for a treat. Brian, can you give us the next slide, please? There we go. So who is George? Okay, so whoops. So on the screen, you see George's credentials. And what's not on here is his roots. So George introduced many of us to PBIS in the mid and late 90s when he was at the University of Oregon and taught us all the basics. Currently, he's our senior advisor for the center, and we were really thrilled to invite him back because George has always taught us about changing context and changing messages and paying attention to the environment and paying attention to the shifting needs. And always the teacher. And I'll tell you, in 2020, we need George to help us again and be our teacher. Most of us learned how to train and how to be a coach and the importance of taking behavioral science and putting it inside an entire school around all the adults from George. So he's been right now he's professor emeritus, and before that he was an endowed chair, which shows you the significance of the impact he's had on people all over the country. And George is, as I said, always a teacher. And Brian, give us the next slide. And George's current life context, of course. Let's take a picture of G-Con George here. I'm not seeing that. He's got his background in the Green Mountains, but I wanted to let everybody know that this is George's mission in life, is to change everything for the positive for all of our grandbabies, all of our children, and children everywhere. So help me in welcoming, silently and virtually, George Sugai. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Lucille. Give me a thumbs up, Lucille, if you can see my screen and you can hear me. Cool.
We're working, George.
Great.
George.
Thank you.
So sorry. Brian, do you want to interject with a couple of pointers for those who are still having some technology problems over in Pathable?
Sure. I think we're paying attention to chat, and we know that some of you are still trying to get your system to work. We also have, it's working for lots of people as well. So
the most common advice from our tech team is to refresh and maybe do it more than one time as everybody's joining at the same time. So I was monitoring the chat. That's the most common.
Okay. I think we're good to go. George, take it away.
Cool, thank you. And make sure you refresh your drinks, make sure you refresh your bowl of popcorn and so forth. It's really a pleasure to be able to come back again and spend a little time with you all. It's a little bit weird to do it virtually, but I'm happy to be here, and I'll try to do my best to meet some of the expectations that Lucille and Brian and the rest of the center has kind of thrown at me as we go through this process. I do really welcome all of you that are here. I know that there's close to 3,000, if not more, participants. I know that some of you are having your evening cocktails. Some of you are getting your eggs and bacon ready for breakfast. Some of you are getting your popcorn and milk ready for night. Some of you are doing your graham crackers and tea ready. So I know there's lots of different people at different places, and I'll try to make sure that the content makes sense to you in the context of why we're all here at this particular event. Of course, I want to acknowledge the center. I want to acknowledge the forum team. I want to acknowledge the conference team. They've done a phenomenal job of putting this event together without much experience. The virtual forum is something we have not done obviously before, and so far it's gone quite smoothly, and I'm very happy that it has gone this way, and it's made my job in just focusing on the presentation only. I do want to acknowledge something that Lucille said, and that is, you know, people like myself and Rob and Tim and Heather and Brandy and Kent and so forth, the so-called leaders at the center, you know, we are only kind of the mouth for the center. And all the credit really goes to the students, families, educators, psychologists, counselors, OTPTs, and so forth, researchers who've done the work. We would only be successful if the implementers have done their job of implementing with high fidelity and producing those outcomes that are important. People like myself are privileged. We're in a very lucky role to be the mouth for the center and the PBIS effort. And I just want to acknowledge that we are up here because of the work of the 3,500 people in this forum, as well as those who are unable to participate in this event. I also want to acknowledge that I've been retired for a year and 175 days. And in part, that's a context for understanding where I'm coming from, but it's also a disclaimer because I've not been actively involved in the day-to-day functioning of PBIS implementation. But I really do find this as a great opportunity to be able to share with you some reflections, especially under these pretty trying times. Yes, I'm a professor emeritus, I'm a senior advisor. Basically what that means is I'm an old guy and they want to give you a little bit of title to make you feel good when they take over your office. But I really am still cheering for what's going on at the center level and what's going on at the classroom level and what's going on in our communities as well. Fortunately, I've been able to sleep at night because we can hand over some of these responsibilities over to a great leadership team. The PBIS Center is made up of 18 or 19 individuals, and we have 4 individuals who are leading the process. And it really does make me feel good and allows me to feel comfortable with where we're headed. Just the fact that there are 3,500 people on this forum is a good data point for indicating how well we've been doing over the last 2.5, 3 years or so. I also want to acknowledge that one of the most important things about my life, having sort of stepped away from being the co-director, has been that I am now a grandparent for the first time. And Lucille acknowledged that I am now called a Jichan, which is the Japanese term for grandfather, and Betsy is now called a Nana. And Kenzo is about 16 weeks old, and he's pretty cool. So now you're going to start hearing examples from our grandkid, and you're going to start knowing that some of my distractions are because of him and not because of some other things that are going on. For those of you that care, that's what he looks like, and he is a pretty cool kid. All right, so get back onto the real stuff here. I really view this opportunity for the next 55 minutes or so to be able to share with you some reflections. As Lucille suggested, I've been at this working with individuals with disabilities and their environments for about 49 years now. I love that work and have become much more of an advocate for that world over the years that I've been working. What I really want to do in this particular session, though, is give you a chance to be able to think about where we're at in the context of the last 4, 5, 6 years or so. And because this whole forum has through itself a strand or a sense of sort of a backbone, if you will, of focus on equity and justice and diversity, I want us to think about what that means for us as PBISers or MTSSers or SELers or whatever. And I want us to think about where our roots are and how important it is to stay close to those roots as we deal with what we're dealing with now and as we move forward over the next 24, 36, 48 months or so. My rationale is really about, oh my gosh, we've got some pretty significant contemporary events that are happening. Not only with the pandemic, but also with some of the things that are happening on our streets, the things that are happening in our federal government, in our politics at our state level and so forth. And they're causing significant disruptions. And people are being affected. Many, of course, are managing well, but there are those that are having trouble navigating those. And we're starting to see the effects of those inside our schools. And I want to argue that our PBIS framework, or at least the concepts behind them, allow us to be able to respond to some of that trauma, if you will, in a way that's going to allow us to be more effective and more efficient. I worry that we let go of the things that we know can work because we're faced with these things that look a little different than we've experienced in the past. But I really do believe that there are some basics, some fundamentals that serve as a ground basis for kind of addressing how we're going to move forward under these pretty trying times. You're going to hear us at this conference, at this forum, speak a lot about justice, equity, and diversity. And one of my outcomes that I'm hoping you'll walk away with is this idea that if we do our job well in the implementation of the PBIS framework and its practices and systems, if we become much more accurate and fluent with our use of those practices and systems, we will create learning environments, living environments that will become more just, will become more equitable, and become much more diverse. Unfortunately, this is something that's going to be a significant challenge for us given the current contemporary kind of challenges. But I also believe that it has to be part of our focus as we move ourselves forward. Now, a couple things I want you to remember. One is I'm going to talk at you for the next few minutes or so. If you have questions or comments, please put them into the chat or into the Q&A. And also, I'll be participating for a little bit in session A1 and try to address some of those comments. So I apologize for not being able to address your comments directly during this time, but I want you to know that I'm going to try really hard to respond to them at some later time. All right, so let's get on to the content a little bit. And I also understand that about 70% of you, 65 to 70% of you, are new to the forum, which is incredibly fascinating to me. Because as Lucille indicated, we've been doing this for over a decade, and the fact that people are new is really not only encouraging, but also a difficult balance for people like me who have to set up this forum. So I'm going to try to mix a little bit of what I like to call the basics or the big ideas, along with some things that are currently kind of new, if you will, in our current efforts. So those of you that are sort of veterans at the PBIS implementation who could easily do the same presentation, you know, what I want you to think about is how can you take what we talk about at this forum back into your work and making sure that it is being implemented with high fidelity. Those of you that are new, take this back with your teams and say, how do we become fluent at being able to take these things on? So again, a little bit of review, a little bit of practice, and then a little bit of new stuff. My goal again is to give you some things to think about, and we'll see how we go from there. So as I mentioned, oh my gosh, there's so much going on right now. And students, educators, families, community members, myself, people at the center, people in our schools, people in our mental health communities have significant issues that not only are in education, but that are impacting us from other disciplines and other contexts as well. That seems very overwhelming. One thing I'd like us to think about, at least for the forum, is start at the place where you know you can have the most direct impact. And for many of us, that's education. That's where I am focusing my attention because I know that I can't take on many of those other boxes. It won't stop me from trying, but I know that much of the impact that I can have are the places where I know the most and I'm most comfortable working. I think it's really important to understand that COVID-19, that the challenges out on the street, that the stuff happening in our politics and so forth, are things that were happening now, but we still need to anticipate a little bit about how we're going to respond after as well as in the long term. So thinking not only from a crisis management perspective, from a trauma-informed perspective, but also where are we going to go as we kind of move this and evolve further. So if you're paying attention, here's one slide that I think is important for you to remember. And as I always like to argue, this will be on the test at the end of the day. This particular picture or this particular kind of set of words, and a lot of them on the screen, I apologize for that, but kind of summarizes how I think about where we're at now. And those of you that are PBISers already will see how this all kind of fits together. Those of you that are here to learn about classroom management, that's great, but I want you to understand how classroom management practices fits into the bigger scheme of implementation and systems. So the big idea is the following. We have conditions that are quite challenging, and we will always have conditions that are challenging. Right now, we have some pretty significant ones that are causing us some quite a bit of angst and tears and sweat and so forth. We need to be clear that those conditions have certain features about them that make it difficult for our kids, our families, and our staff and our community members. We have to become much more efficient, equitable, empirically sound, and data informed as we make our decisions and how we're going to respond. We can't do random thinking. We can't just throw something at the problem. We've got to become much more efficient. And we need to do it in a way that's just and equitable. Because without that kind of set of guidelines, we are not going to be able to respond to the challenges in front of us and how we set up our future. I think it's really important to have the outcome in mind. And that outcome has to be one that is beneficial, just, and equitable for everybody. But from my perspective, especially for those individuals who are high risk or have been disenfranchised by how we do the work that we do, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. We are about everyone, but we also know that there are individuals who need a little extra, and there are some who need a whole lot of support in order for these systems to work well. So to kind of summarize again, we have significant challenges in front of us. Yes, they are, the slope is steep, which means we have to become much more informed, much more organized in our responses. We need to make much more informed decisions, and we need to keep the outcome in mind as we make those decisions. I'll come back to that as we go. Why am I focused on education? Why do I think the forum has to focus on education and those kind of disciplines that affect education, like mental health, like medicine and so forth? Is because schools are one of the things that are available in all our communities. And because they're available in all our communities, they're the perfect place for us to be able to organize how we implement. Our PBIS efforts started at the classroom level with individual kids and with classrooms, but we quickly expanded and we focused on the school system as our place. Schools are important because remotely or in classroom, we have access to kids and we have an opportunity to maximize academic achievement. We have access to engage kids. We have access to being able to support kids who give us indications of risk. We have opportunities to work with families who are interacting with us and so forth. Schools are a great investment, and I think we have to keep that in mind as we move forward on our implementation efforts. Now, this is a different way of sort of thinking about where we're at, but I think it's important because what it does is tells us is that you can have the best interventions for teaching reading, the best interventions for teaching calculus, the best intervention for trauma-informed supports, the best intervention for teaching social skills. But unless the system that is developing, presenting, making adaptations to those practices, the outcomes will be affected. I've learned from my colleagues, one in particular, Rob Horner, who's taught me that, yes, the individual is absolutely important, but how the individuals work collectively becomes our focus. Each of you that are participating in this forum are individuals. Each of you as individuals are participants in groups, be them a school, a district, a mental health facility, a group home, or whatever. Effective organizations, be them schools, businesses, clubs, teams, whatever, they all have three critical features. They have a common vision, a common language, and a common experience. I love our PBIS community because we have a common vision about where we want to go. We have a common language by which we have conversations and get our work done. And we have a common experience, a set of procedures, a set of routines that define who we are. But that vision, that language and those experiences don't happen by chance. They happen because we organize our implementation to achieve those key features. PBIS is about a common vision, common language, common experience. A positive school climate is about a common vision, common language, common experience. I think it's really important that you keep in mind that one of the key outcomes of this forum is defining and refining our vision, our language, and our experiences. If you think about how each of those three elements get operationalized, they fall out as these elements. They turn out to be social competence, behavioral norms. They turn out to be the things that we talk about with respect to academic achievement. They focus on data and communication and how we engage each other. And they focus on policy, routines, procedures, and teaming, and so forth. As you go through this conference, this forum, you will see different strands, different sessions focusing on different aspects of those elements. But the whole is how the organization functions. It's how you bring all those together. So when you're sitting in a classroom management session, as you're sitting in an equity session, I want you to think about what outcomes are expected, how we communicate, and what systems are required to make what you're learning have an impact. Effective organizations have a common vision, a common language, and a common experience. Now, a little bit of review for the 65% of you that are sort of new to this process. And I know some of you in the 65% have already started the implementation because you've been working with your teams. Your state level team has been supporting what's going on at the school level. Some of you are at the country level and you're providing policy. Some of you have no idea what's going on in this particular forum. If I had to bring it down to two critical elements, these are the two elements. You've heard about MTSS, multi-tiered systems. You've heard about RTI. The big idea around a continuum of support is sort of the backbone for all those big words. PBIS, MTSS, RTI, whatever those things are, it's about creating a continuum of supports. If you remember nothing else, if you want to work with individuals, you got to work with all. If you work with all, you got to pay attention to the individuals. And we know that the supports that are provided are going to be varied in intensity based on the needs of those individuals along that continuum. But to make that framework work well, that MTSS, RTI, PBIS continuum work well, that framework, you've got to organize yourselves, as I've already mentioned, around outcomes, systems, and data and practices. What I think is important about those four elements is that they be culturally contextualized. We know that the outcomes need to be culturally equitable. We know that the practices need to be culturally relevant. We know that the staff need to be culturally knowledgeable. And we know that the decisions have to be culturally sensitive. It is really important as we move forward now in our work within the PBIS framework from 2020 and beyond under these current contexts, that we focus on those four elements, make sure they're culturally contextualized, and can think about that continuum. And I don't care if you work at the state level, at the SEA level, if you work at the federal level, if you work at the country level. Those key concepts have application across your contexts. So I'm not going to go through this listing. As I mentioned, the handouts are available. If you click on the agenda site or whatever it's your session site, it's also available through the forum and also the PBIS Center site. But these effective organizations, have some critical characteristics. And what's key about these effective organizations is they arrange the environment for success. It's not a rearranging kids, it's rearranging the environment so kids can be successful. It's rearranging the staff of a school. It's not about rearranging the staff of a school, it's rearranging how the routines of the school are in implementation so the staff can be successful. And we do that by focusing on data. We do that by making sure we focus on prevention where we do no harm. We do that by making sure we keep the continuum or three-tiered logic in mind. We do that by making sure that the principals and superintendents and department chairs model what we're asking staff to do. We do that by making sure we don't forget about those individuals and groups who might be disenfranchised by what we do when we do school-wide or classroom-wide. So the big idea here is that there are two critical elements, the continuum and those four critical elements of outcomes, data, and practice and systems. When you put those together, we're trying to create an effective organization. And that effective organization is not about changing kids directly, it's about changing the environment so kids can be successful. It's about changing the school as a whole so that staff can be successful in the work that they're doing with kids. It's about changing how the district is organized in order for schools to be more effective in their implementation. A major big idea again is it really is focusing on making the environment a much more positive, caring, preventative, and positive kind of place to work. Okay, just a quick little off the press. Kent just sent these to me yesterday. They're a little bit incomplete because we don't have all the data sources, but what's cool about this is that we have about 27,000 schools who report using PBIS, which is about 30% of all schools in the United States, and it impacts about 15 million kids. On the surface, we say that is really cool. 27,000 schools or more are, quote, doing PBIS. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that because you have a poster on the wall does not mean that you're doing PBIS. It doesn't mean you're doing MTSS if you have a poster on the wall, if you have a binder on the shelf, if you have an in-service at the beginning of the school year and that's it. PBIS is more than that. It's about making sure that we implement the practices with high fidelity. Right now, according to our data set, we have, I think, about 63% of the schools, oops, I'm sorry, that's not correct. We'll back up a second. Of the schools that have reported using PBIS of the schools that are reporting, checking for their fidelity, 63% of them are implementing with fidelity. So of the schools that are implementing, of those schools that are checking their fidelity, about 63% or so, plus or minus some number, are implementing with enough fidelity to maximize the likelihood that kids are going to benefit. That means that there are about 37% of the schools that have posters on the wall or are just starting the process. 63% is quite a good number when you think organizationally, but it's not quite what Rob Horner and I like to think about as being the best possible. We want to get that number up to 85%. This forum is here because we know schools want to implement with fidelity. And this forum is about how to tweak your systems to increase your level of implementation. So pat yourselves on the back if you're implementing with 85% fidelity for tier 1 in particular. If you are in the process, that's your goal. If you're not, what can your team do to improve that quality of implementation? And I truly believe that this forum will be a place to achieve that. All right, so that kind of set us up. I sort of described a little bit about how PBIS, MTSS, RTI, and so forth is this framework that we use to do our work. I tried to make the case that without the framework, it's difficult to respond to some of the things that are in front of us. I tried to make the case that, you really got to be strategic about what you're doing. And again, my job is to kind of highlight those critical features. The forum is really about getting down into those decisions that have to be made. I want to spend the last 35 minutes I have or so doing two things. I want to give us a context for why the work that we're doing needs to become much more deliberate under the current context of our contemporary implementation in schools right now. And then I'm going to finish up a little bit about culture and how culture is a big deal. And we'll kind of go from there. Now, if you come from the mental health world, from the public health world, if you come from a prevention perspective, what I'm going to describe for you is not new. But I want to highlight it because I think it's important for us as we make decisions on rolling our content forward. So I like to think about the world. I've been taught to think about the world as having basically sort of two critical things that affect how we do our work. There are risk factors and there are protective factors. And what I like us to think about is that each one of us, every single kid, every single family member, comes to an environment with certain risk factors, a certain combination of risk factors. And that combination of risk factors affects how they might respond in a given environment. In our schools, we spend a lot of our time putting in place protective factors. We do things to accommodate, respond to risk factors that most kids come to our school with. PBIS Tier 1 in particular is a set of protective factors that anticipates anybody who comes into the school and says, let's make sure it's a safe, positive, productive, efficient environment for you. Such things as we maximize academic achievement, such things as teaching social skills, such things as modeling pro-social behavior, such things as making sure kids are screened on a regular basis, et cetera, et cetera. Those are what we call protective factors because we know all of us come to learning environments with certain risks. Unfortunately, despite what kids come to school with, there are additional things that enhance the likelihood that kids, adults, ourselves are going to fail or have challenges at school. When trauma happens, In the last decade or so, actually more than that now, much of the PBIS focus has been on school violence, responding to mass murders inside of schools. We're really concerned about what kind of modeling occurs in social media. We're very concerned about what happens in our streets. We're very concerned about discrimination and effects that has on kids and family members and certain members of our communities. Those significant events, those wildfires, those hurricanes, those increase the risk of our learners. Right now, in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years or so, especially now in 2020, there's a gray cloud that's hanging over us, and it's causing some of those minor risk factors to become major risk factors. It's causing some of those things that are usually manageable to become much more complicated as kids, family members navigate their schools, their remote learning, as well as those when they come to school as well. And you can kind of think about what those mean for yourselves as well as for the kids and families, because we know that it's not just about kids, it's about all those individuals who interact with kids. Unfortunately, when those things happen, people respond, and it's oftentimes in the form of reactive management. And we have this gut level response to try to how to solve the impact of those traumatic events. Unfortunately, what happens is we do things without thinking through whether or not they're evidence-based. We do them without thinking if they're culturally or contextually relevant. We do them without thinking about whether or not it's actually going to be helpful to kids in the environments in which they're being affected, and so forth and so on. We sometimes isolate people, we segregate people, we exclude people because we think that's best as a best response. Unfortunately, many of those responses have been shown to be very ineffective, especially when there are significant traumatic events, significant risks, if you will. I really want to suggest to you that that is where we're at now. And as we think about what's happening, as we think about kids trying to get back into school, trying to navigate their Zoom classrooms, we need to be very clear that we try to develop and identify strategies that will be the most effective and most efficient under the very trying times. Our continuum of supports is being pushed around. I really do believe that there are more kids out there who are going to require tier 2 and tier 3 supports out there under these conditions than we've ever had, because they are under these significant stressors. And now we need to think about, what does it really mean to do check-in, check-out under conditions of remote learning? What does it really mean to do a functional behavioral assessment for a kid who's having a hard time, navigating the remote learning situations and so forth? Big deal for us. Now, fortunately, which is where I'm going to end up, we have some tools that increase the likelihood of us being able to respond, maybe not as successfully as we have in the past, but better under these more traumatic conditions. And again, if you look on the right-hand side, they're all the things we've already talked about, which is why many of you are involved in the PBIS forum, because you want to become fluent with those things that will help us respond in a more effective way to some of these traumatic events. Trauma-informed decision-making, prevention-based approaches, the continuum, using your data, making sure that we have leadership that's informed, and so forth down the list. Many of those are the sessions that the conference planning team and the center identified as being important sessions for this forum. Because why? They are effective responses that enhance the protective factors that are part of our school. So this conference, this forum, is about maximizing the impact of protective factors in ways that are defendable and actually produce the outcomes that we want. This movement right now towards trauma-informed interventions is significant, and I want to argue that trauma-informed PBIS, MTSS, or whatever is got to become part of how we think about implementation. Not in a reactive way, but in a preventative way of saying, how do we help kids navigate these environments in ways they can be successful, and how do we support kids who've been traumatically affected by their experiences? I want to encourage you to take a look at a site. I'm going to do this a couple times throughout the rest of the time I have, to make sure that you look at some of the work that's out there, because we are becoming more informed about what is more defendable on the trauma-informed side. And there's one site called the Tolerance Project that has really done a nice job of identifying those practices that can be the most effective. And I want to highlight a couple of these things only because when you look at what the trauma-informed model highlights, they're very similar to what we're already endorsing, giving priority to within the forum. Teaching routines, building relationships, working from an MTS perspective, and so forth. We are already overlapping in the work that we're doing. Your job as a team is to become efficient in trying to work together as opposed to individual efforts. Right now, I know that schools are trying to think about PBIS, they're trying to think about social emotional learning, they're trying to think about trauma-informed supports, and others. I would love to argue, I could probably do a pretty good job arguing, that there's more overlap between those efforts than there are differences. And as we build our team-based implementation, we should be building an integrated system as opposed to a PBIS team, SEL team, or trauma-informed team. We've got to pull them together, because without that, we're going to be struggling with the minutes and the efficiency to deal with those challenges that are part of our current context. The center has put together similar works. What I really would like to reinforce is that many of those documents at the PBIS Center have become collaborative efforts with the SCL Center, with the different centers throughout the Department of Education, and so forth. And I encourage you to take a look at those. There are efforts outside of the center that you should also look at. Recently, there was a nice document from the Council of Chief State Officers about how to respond. And again, I want you to think about this as seeing overlapping practices as well as overlapping implementation efforts. And from the behavioral sciences side, which is something Lucille mentioned at the beginning, this is a book that's been out for a while, but I'd really like you to go back and skim it, because what Tony does in this book about nurturing schools in our world is really focusing again on what we talk about for our work in the PBIS world. Okay, so another big idea for you. I want you to think about the rest of what I'm going to present from the perspective of how do we do a few things really well for all members of the community along the continuum. It's not about doing more, it's about doing a few things really well. We've got to organize our implementation so that we are very strategic in the practices that we pick. They have to be high probability impact interventions. They've got to be equitable. And we've got to do it in a way that's not just a 90-minute in-service, but it has to be one that says we can maximize our accuracy of implementation that will last over time and can be generalizable across different contexts. Now, those are a lot of big words. The most important thing for you to think about is what can we do? What are the few things we can do to have the biggest impact? There's a tendency to come to this forum and want to do everything that you learn, everything that you're exposed to. We set the forum up for you to work as teams so you make decisions about what's going to be most contextually and culturally relevant for your population of students, families, and staff members with whom you work. All right, so to finish off, I promised you that I wanted to spend a little time on culture and climate. I know that some of you have heard me do this little session before, and so I apologize for that. Don't tell the answers in the chat when I ask you some questions, but I really want us to think about where we're at now in 2020. And I want you to think about some of the things that we are struggling with on our implementation of multi-tiered systems and PBIS in 2020. And as we move forward into the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years or so. And again, I'm sharing something with you that I've learned from others, but I'm going to try to personalize it in a way that you can think about this from your perspective and your context. And I'm hoping that you'll walk away with some big ideas that will improve the decisions that you make for the practices you select. To give you a context for how this works, and I know some of you have seen this picture before, so I apologize for that, but I'm going to use it again because I like using it. I want you to think about your answer to the following question. And the question is, where was this picture taken? Now, this picture was taken, frankly, on a bicycle ride with my son, who's on the left-hand side of this picture, when we did a cross-country bicycle ride from Oregon to Washington, D.C. And we went through a number of states, and we stopped one place, and my son saw this sign, and he said to me, "How far away is the wood?" And I had to say to him, "Son, it's not how far away the wood is. They have a different message. And the message is, we have firewood for sale. Got firewood. Got firewood for sale. It's like got milk, right?" Now, my son, he was born on the West Coast. His learning experience, his upbringing, his interactions were West Coast focused. And he had me as a father. His experience, his background affected how he saw that sign. And he was looking at it from a firewood perspective. So the question to you is, what state was that? 1001, 1002, 1003. The answer is Maryland. Now, the reason I like to show this picture and the reason I like to indicate to you that it's Maryland is because I'm willing to bet you my wife's next month's Social Security check that many of you said Idaho. Many of you said Mississippi. Some of you said Western Mass. Some of you said east side of Boston or whatever, right? Some of you identified a place based on your experiences with those kinds of words and those kinds of symbols and images. I want to argue that my son's learning experiences, my personal learning history, your learning history affects how you respond to the environment that you move through. And I'm going to suggest that culture, context, language is all a relationship to what your learning history is about. So let me go a little further with that. I want you to look at these pictures, and there are a whole bunch of different people in this picture. And there are certain images, there's certain parts of these images, there are certain contexts in which the pictures are taken that probably trigger different responses, different interpretations, different assumptions. Your learning history, the people you've interacted with, the friends you have, the places you've lived, are going to affect how you describe these pictures or individual pictures, and also how you act upon those words and those experiences. I'm going to suggest to you culture has a whole lot to do with your cultural actions have a whole lot to do with your learning history. Now, to make it a little bit more close to home, this picture shows an office in a school, and that's the principal sitting in the office. And he has 3 kids waiting to see him. One kid has been sent to the office for using the SHIT word. One kid has been sent to the office for using the FUCK word. I'm looking at the closed captions to see how those come out. And another kid's been sent to the office for saying, "I said Christmas." Now, all 3 of those kids have been sent to the office by someone because of those behaviors. The question to you is, should all 3 of those kids be sitting on the bench? Who sent those kids to the bench? What was their perception about those behaviors or those words that triggered them to send the kid to the office? Especially that kid who said, "I said Christmas." Our data is very clear. If you happen to have a disability, if you're Black, and if you're a male, you're 4 to 6 times more likely to be sitting on that bench for the same behavior that the other 2 kids are there. Family members, community members, students, teachers, administrators all have a learning history. Those learning histories meld or they bump into each other based on what's going on. And those going-ons result in actions that sometimes cause kids, family members, and others to be disenfranchised from the environments in which they're navigating. And I want to again argue that it's about cultural norms and how our experiences kind of operationalize our actions. there are some places you can go to kind of challenge yourselves around that. One good example that I like is a TED Talk that a person by the name of Rosemary Allen did a number of years ago that talked about how school suspensions are not just about kids, they're actually about the adults and the policies in place in those environments. And I encourage you to go take a look at these different kinds of resources that are out there. So just a little bit of a kind of way that we like to think about the world. And I give credit to this to Brita O'Keefe and Lindsay Fallon, who I've worked with in the past, who really argue that culture, whatever the size of the group is, be it the Little League team, be it that hate group, be it the school, be it the Little League, be it the PBIS membership, it's a group of individuals. And they are defined by what they say and what they do. And they have a shared learning history. When you walk away from this forum, you will have experienced a series of events that have been shared by all of us. And you will verbalize and act upon that experience. And that experience will either differentiate you from one group or will cause you to be overlapping with another group. And it will predict how you behave in the future. So any kind of group, any kind of culture is going to be defined by that learning history, which is sort of the way I like to think about it. Does it change over time? Absolutely. Can it become stronger or better? Can it be weakened? Can it be pro-social versus anti-social? Absolutely. But I want us to think about the importance of our experiences as we move through our different learning environments, our families, our communities, our schools, and the impact it has. Now, what I want to do for the next 3 or 4 minutes is to describe for you a way to think about your learning environment. Now, I'm going to share with you a little bit about me, and I don't want you to think about me. I want you to think about yourself. And I'm going to share with you a series of event circles around this big circle. And I want you to start filling in your circles as I go around it. Because I want to argue that my learning history predicts how I'm going to behave in the future. And some of that is something I'm very aware of, and some of it I'm not aware of. But the fact that I respond in certain kinds of contexts suggests that that history has an impact on how I behave. Sometimes it's pro-social, sometimes it's anti-social. So just bear with me a little bit as I walk through this, and I'll go through it fairly quickly. So as Lucille indicated to you, in a couple ways. One is I'm an old guy. I was born in 1951, and I was born in Santa Cruz, California. So I'm a Californian by birth, and I grew up there. My parents, who are Japanese Americans, were born in Watsonville, California. And I'm what's called a sansei. I'm a third generation Japanese American, and my parents are Nisei, they're second generation. And my grandparents are called Issei, they're first generation, and they came over from Japan and became citizens when they got here. I grew up in California, in Santa Cruz, and in Los Gatos, California. I grew up in an environment where my parents raised me as a Buddhist. I learned a lot about Buddhism during that time. However, I struggled with going to Sunday school because I'd much rather play baseball than that. And I became much more involved in Little League Baseball during that time. In 1942, my mother was interned or incarcerated in prison camps in California. She was one of 110,000 Japanese Americans who were told to go to camp, not summer camp, but to incarceration camp, because they were Japanese American and were viewed as a threat because of World War II and the start of the war with Japan. And my mother spent 2.5 years behind barbed wire. My dad and his family moved to Utah because you could move inland and away from the coast to a neutral, supportive state. As a result of that experience for my family, my mother and my father in particular, my aunts and uncles and so forth, for going to camp to be in prison for 2.5 years, when they had us, my sister and I as kids, they just made a decision, conscious, unconscious, whatever, to make sure that we would fit in to American culture. We didn't learn to speak Japanese after that. We started eating with forks and knives instead of with hashi or chopsticks. We started referring to we stopped referring to shoyu instead referred to soy sauce. They wanted us to become more American because being Japanese resulted in this exclusion and this imprisonment. As a result, I went to primarily a white high school. My parents made the decision to move to Los Gatos, because that was where they could provide opportunities for my sister and I to be more successful. And I went to a high school of, in my senior class had, I think, 400 people, 500 kids in it. And there were 2 Japanese Americans, and there was 1 African American who was a foreign exchange student. So I grew up in a community that was not very diverse. My biggest struggle during that time, which was 1964 through 69, was about where am I going to lean? Because if you think about the 60s, that was the time during the Vietnam War protests, during the kind of the flower child environments. And my biggest struggle during that time, frankly, was am I going to lean towards the Stones or am I going to lean towards the Beatles? Fascinating thing about being a Japanese American in this particular school environment is my best friends, Dale, Jim, Lansing, Molly, Roger, were all white. You know, Lansing was a Chinese American. He came a little bit later. He was one of my buddies. But Molly was a white girl. Now, Molly's in quotes because at the time, I sort of had a crush on Molly. But the problem is that Molly was white. And my parents weren't quite ready to go that far with me being more white, more American. And that wasn't encouraged. So I always kind of adored, if you will, or watched Molly from afar, because that was not quite, my parents weren't quite ready to reinforce that kind of relationship yet. Again, part of their learning experience affected how they raised me and affected how I responded. I went to the University of California, Santa Barbara for my undergraduate degree. My undergraduate degree was in botany, because I was an environmentalist at the time. Good or bad, the Vietnam War protests were at their height. I became heavily influenced by sort of the counterculture. I watched them burn the Bank of America down as part of the protests. I didn't light the match, but I watched it burn down. There were experiences happening at that time that approximated what's going on now. And that learning experience at University of California, Santa Barbara, and Goleta and Isla Vista affects how I respond to what's going on contemporarily now. But was fascinating kind of experience. As a botany major, because that was my major in my undergraduate degrees in biology or botany, one of my summer activities was to become a summer camp counselor. And I became a summer camp counselor in an Easter seal camp. And in that experience, I learned about kids with multiple disabilities. And I decided at that point that I was going to become a special educator. So I went to the University of Washington, got my my teaching degree and my master's degree in special ed. And my advisor at the time, Rick Neal, introduced me to a kid by the name of Gary. And Gary taught me how to blow up toilets. And Gary was a kid who was in a lockdown facility for kids with emotional behavioral disorders and had broken the law. And the way you blow up toilets, by the way, is to light the fuse on an M80, drop it in, count to 3, and then flush. It's pretty phenomenal. But at that time, I learned, 1974, that I really wanted to work with kids who had emotional behavioral disorders. And that's sort of where my career shifted. I worked in a number of states. Each of those states had an effect on how I viewed the world, how I thought about special ed, how I thought about myself as a Japanese American, and so forth. It's a really great experience to spend different time in those places, just because it really pushes that sort of learning history and shapes where it goes. I am very lucky. I am married to a person who is white Hispanic. I'm in a biracial marriage. Her name is Betsy Fernandez. She's a school principal, or was a school principal. And now, finally, I'm in a biracial relationship. My parents have finally kind of loosened up around that idea, and it's great. We have 2 kids who are called Hapa or Hafu. Some of you know my daughter, who is Reiko Elizabeth Sugai Fernandez, and my son, who is Kyoshi Kane Sugai Fernandez. We use the Mexican or tradition, if you will, to put the male's name first in the hyphenation. And we use My wife wanted Japanese names for our first name. So the idea is to allow our kids to be able to get into any job or any high school, any college that they wanted to, just based on their name, which is sort of why we did that approach, sort of. Now I'm retired, and now I have a grandson, and my grandson was born in June of 2020. And all of a sudden, my priorities have become much more, my professional priorities have become much more focused, because my grandson, our grandson, is now going to have to grow up in the culture, the climate that we are creating right now. And so my investments, my outcomes are significantly more important to me. Now, again, I don't care that you kind of identify with any of the particulars of that circle. What I care about is that you put your critical events, those critical experiences, those critical kind of life experiences that have shaped who you are. Because who you are will affect how you engage in your profession, work as a team member, make selections of interventions, make decisions on how you interpret the data, have an impact on how you interact with a kid, how you respond to what's happening in social media and so forth. And we've got to be really careful about that, because our learning history sometimes may not be as equitable and just as it should be for the climates and the individuals that are involved. Now, the reason again I did this is because one of your homework assignments is to do this and to submit it to Brian on Monday, so he can take a look at see what your profile looks like. Now, a little bit of more data behind that. Now, the big idea, just to refresh, is that we have this framework that serves as the organizer for the work that we do. I want to make a case that we have to be much more strategic in thinking about how we implement that framework under our contemporary situation, and that we need to make sure that we are considerate of our learning history's effect on the equity and justice impact of our classroom, schools, and communities. A little bit of data for you to show you why this is such a big deal. The Pew Survey came out in June of 2020. This is one of their many surveys. And what they found out that is after the coronavirus outbreak, Asian and Black Americans were more likely to report negative aversive experiences because of their race and ethnicity. 4 out of 10 Americans generally reported greater likelihood of hearing racist views being expressed in their interactions with others. Asian Americans and Black Americans are more likely to worry about being stereotyped because of wearing masks. 3 out of 10 Americans report racist views becoming more common around Asian and Black Americans. We now know that people's learning experiences, learning histories, are affecting how they're responding to the images and experiences they're having right now. In California, the Asian American Planning Council found that there were 673 coronavirus discrimination incidences in California. 90% of them or so were race-based. Of those, 61% of those were against non-Chinese Asians, right? 67% of those deal with verbal harassment. Many of them were from young individuals, and many of them were focused on women and businesses. We have data to suggest, at least from people's reports, that the impact of what's going on now is big. In my world of Asian Americans, we know that stuff is happening out there. And kids are walking into schools with that baggage, with those risk factors. Kids are coming into our schools being heavily traumatized and not able to function inside our schools or on our Zoom classrooms because of those effects. And we need to be sensitive to that, not only in preventing it from happening in the future, but how are we going to provide our trauma-informed strategies to help kids be successful in kind of navigating their responses. Me personally, there's so many things that I have never thought of as being significant until my parents kind of raised me the way I did, and because of things that are happening now. I can't tell you the number of times that some of these questions have been asked of myself, of my sister, of people in my family. I mean, just because of my appearance, there's an assumption that I've lived in Japan. Because I look Asian, there's an assumption that I know how to do Kung Fu. because of the, and so forth and so on, and the stereotypes that occur around them. I know that each of you, because of your appearance, because of your background, because of the things you do, oftentimes experience similar stereotypical, inappropriate kinds of comments. I'd encourage you to take a look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, because what they've done is highlighted some of the groups out there that have reinforced some of the things that we struggle with. The Southern Poverty Law Center has indicated that in 2019, we don't have the 2020 data yet, that there are about 940 hate groups around the country that are engaging in supporting of white nationalist groups that are discriminating against LGBTQ individuals and are actually blanketing the social media world with their statements and their vision and language, if you will. We know that's been steadily increasing over the last few years, and we got to become much more cognizant of the impact. We know that there are different numbers of these identified groups across different states. Most of them have become much more visible over the last 3, 4, or 5 years. Some of them are still covert and behind the scenes. And the numbers vary by states, but every state has at least one that we notice that are out there in the world. The FBI reports over the last 2 or 3 years have reinforced the concern about the number of hate crimes, especially those dealing with immigration, those dealing with race and ethnicity, religious bias, sexual orientation, and so forth. We know those are increasing. We know the same thing about disabilities, which is my world, which is where the PBIS world started and continues to have its emphasis around kids with risk, disability in particular. And we know those numbers are being affected as well. So I'm going to slow down a little bit, because in the last few minutes I have, I'm going to give you something to think about. That is, I want you to double check your learning history. And instead of making it kind of behind the scenes, put it out in front so it becomes more conscious and overt. And stop and check yourself. Work as a team and use your data. I want you to take a look at yourself, not necessarily around the loop, around the circle, but take a look at the experiences you've had that shaped who you are. I know that there are many symbols that have happened in the past that affected my parents, who have affected me, who have affected how I behave. I'd encourage you to take a look at your history. My mother was in Poston, Arizona as part of the camp experience for 2.5 years. My mother experienced things that she graduated from high school in camp, and she married my father after she got out of camp. And that is, on the right-hand side, is a piece of paper that allowed her to move from the camp in Arizona back to California. And that experience has affected who I am. Almost done, Lucille, I see your picture in there. So when you see these pictures, the kids with masks on, what assumptions do you make when you see those pictures because of the images that are on the mask, or how they're being worn, or what's being accompanying those masks? And how do you react to those? And what happens when a kid comes to school wearing one of those? And how do you respond? When you look at your kids on Zoom meetings and you see what they present, how do you respond to that? When you see what's in the background, how do you respond? Because I want to suggest that how we support those kids, how we give them support, how we react, and how we comment has a big effect. Let me pass that by. So, your homework assignment, look in the mirror. And then I want you to walk away from this forum with one thing that you're going to do on Monday that's different. Yes, you're going to do an action plan that's bigger, but you as individuals, I want you to pick one thing that you will do differently. Whether it to be call somebody, whether it to be to acknowledge somebody doing something the right way, be it something that you're going to write down and disseminate. So, concluding requests. From a systems level, I encourage you to get out there and vote your passions, especially around education. I encourage you to join groups that advocate for the things that are important to you in supporting our kids and our schools. I encourage you to invest in public education because that's where the action is. I encourage you to pick up evidence-based practices and be strategic. I encourage you to work with others and I encourage you to think about things from an MTS perspective. On a daily basis, check your temperature and make sure it's equitable. I want you to model what you believe as being the most effective interventions. I want you to catch yourself early before you make mistakes. And I want you to teach others about equitable actions. And I want you to engage others on a regular basis. Those are particularly important now under conditions in which we don't have as much access to kids. There are a number of resources that you can look at. These are just my biased kind of resources on the Asian American side, but I want you to have access to those because you can learn a lot from them, even if you're, quote, not Asian American. And I want to stop there and turn it back to Lucille. You can always get a hold of me at my Professor Emeritus site, if you will, UConn.edu. And you can always get a hold of me through the PBIS.org site. I know that when you contact Kent, Lucille, Heather, or Tim, they will redirect you to me if it's appropriate. And I hope that you have a good forum. I hope that this kind of organize your thinking about yourself and as you move through the forum sessions. And I will officially stop talking, Lucille, and it's your turn.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much for giving of your time and of your personal views and your experience. You never disappoint. You're always current. You always keep us focused and you always make us think. The idea that kids experiencing trauma, for those of us who've worked the mental health side for many years, is not new. Risk and protective factors is not new. But George's point is this needs to be a part of everything we do in schools and be integrated through multiple tiers. There were multiple questions about, or one in particular about why use MTSS when talking about trauma-informed care. And I did encourage people, the mental health strand in particular will address that. And we have several new briefs that are in draft form we're going to share with you. So thank you, George, for making us all think and setting the right tone for the forum today. I think, Brian, do you want to say a few words about some of the technology issues before we take our break? I think the key message is don't use other people's Zoom. Only use the Zoom that you get through your link.
Yep, that was causing some problems. Thank you all. Appreciate your patience. On the screen, we kept providing instructions for how to find your Zoom if needed. I think folks have worked it out. Let's have a great rest of this forum.
See you on the next sessions.
Bye, everybody.